an original MCM production.
And now I'm going to call on Kate Rabb, the retired director of the Milwaukee Public Library, to introduce today's speaker. Kate?
Hello, everybody. I've known John Gurda for more than 30 years, and I probably have known him longer than most of you. We worked together at the Bayview Community Center when I was the librarian at Llewellyn Library, which is now called the Bayview Library and moved. And that was 10 years probably after John had started writing some of his works. And I said one time to John, gee, I really would love to write sometime. Do you enjoy doing it? And he said, no, I really don't like to write, but I love to have written. I think that's a great quote. And he also, when he saw my notes, I said, I've got 4 pages of introduction, and he said, well, when we first knew each other, you didn't have to read from notes that were that big. That's true. So John, I consider John Milwaukee's historian, and I'm thinking how fortunate we are as a city to have a resident author. John grew up in the Jackson Park area of the South Side. He lives in Bayview now with his wife. They have raised 3 children there. And he's devoted himself, his entire career really, to writing about Milwaukee's neighborhoods, people, and businesses. And so I thought, I'm going to see if other cities have someone like John. And so as an experiment, I Googled historian Chicago, historian Detroit, historian Cleveland, both of the Twin Cities. And actually, I couldn't find any other city that is as blessed as Milwaukee is to have someone like John. There is a Dr. Noel in Denver, Colorado, but he's called Dr. Colorado. So I don't think we have any competition. So if you do Google Milwaukee historian, the first thing comes up is a very attractive picture of John and at least 10 entries before you have to scroll down. So I think we're, as I said, very fortunate to have John as a chronicler of Milwaukee history. His works are engaging, they're readable, they're scholarly without being stuffy, and I think that they also are very positive and personal, as well as deeply respectful of the people and places that he writes about. There's nothing dry about John's writings, and if you follow his columns in the Milwaukee Journal on the first Sunday of every month, you know that he writes widely about a variety of subjects. And one of my favorite things about his column last weekend about the Pabst Brewing Company was that actually when the Pabst Brewing Company's people first came here, they were called Best, and Pabst was a son-in-law, is that right, John? But the Best brothers started a vinegar works, which I don't think Pabst is advertising. So today, we are going to hear about John's book, published in 2009 by the Jewish Museum Milwaukee. It's called One People, Many Paths, A History of Jewish Milwaukee. And just coincidentally, we went to the Jewish Museum Milwaukee last week, thanks to Jerry, and for a Rotarian outing. It was fabulous, and there were 2 terrific exhibits. They're traveling exhibits, both about the Holocaust. Excellent. So if you haven't gone, I think it'd be a great idea to go over and see them. And I also just wanted to acknowledge Marcia Saylor, who's here in the room. When I first started as city librarian under the name Kate Houston, Marcia Saylor was helping me with fundraising, and she taught me a great deal about fundraising, and I want to especially thank Marcia for all she did for me in my early career. So now we'll hear about Jewish history of Milwaukee from John.
Hey, thank you, friend Kate, and nice to see so many familiar and friendly faces here. Kate's actually part of this story, going way back to '06, is when she retired as city librarian. And the ceremony was in the rotunda of the Central Library, one of my favorite buildings in Milwaukee, and one of the grandest spaces in the entire city. And I was standing here kind of in the back row, and Marianne Lubar sidled up to me, and in that very direct Marianne Lubar way, said, "We'd like you to write the history of the Jewish community." Sort of the proposal kind of came. We were sitting there wishing Kate farewell into her next stage in her career. Mary Ann was a power in the Library Foundation and had been for many years. And she and her husband Shell were in the process of launching the Jewish Museum of Milwaukee, which does more in a 5,000 square foot space than I think I've ever seen in terms of museum storytelling. So they were in a storytelling mood, and I found the idea immediately intriguing. I'd been studying Milwaukee's history for about 35 years up to that point, back in '06, but I'd never had the chance to study Milwaukee's Jewish history in any depth. It was like discovering a brand new neighborhood in my own hometown, and I was determined to try to learn it from the inside out. So the fact that I grew up Catholic and Polish on the South Side meant I had some catching up to do. This was not something I had learned at my mother's and father's knees. So I began by attending services at virtually every synagogue in the Milwaukee area. That absorbed my Friday evenings and Saturday mornings for weeks on end. My education also included sukkah hopping in the Sherman Park neighborhood in the fall festival of Sukkot, attending a Purim spiel at Congregation Shalom in March, and going to more than one what they're called Torah Paloozas at Emmanuel B'nai Yeshua, and just wonderful events. I learned to wear yarmulke as a matter of course, going into worship spaces. And I was the only Wisconsin Jewish Chronicle subscriber in my block, at least, in Bayview, perhaps in the larger neighborhood. And I became, during the process of research for the book, probably the only person on earth who has turned every page of every issue of the Chronicle from 1921 to 2009. So it took a long time with the Jewish Museum archives. So the result was the book that Kate held up, published back in 2009 by the Jewish Museum, One People, Many Paths, A History of Jewish Milwaukee. I would not presume to tell the story contained in that rather lengthy book in 25 minutes. Instead, I'll give you highlights by telling stories about two sub-communities, two redoubtable women, and that word is one we should use more often. These two really were redoubtable. And the monumental impact that one relatively small group has had on the life of the larger community. Those sub-communities, first of all, as most of you know, Germans have been Milwaukee's largest group almost for as long as there's been in Milwaukee. How many of you have some Germanic background? Raise your hands. That's over half. I did that in Ozaukee County once, and they all raised their hands. They began to arrive back in 1839, when Milwaukee was only 4 years removed from its first public land sale. They were a majority of Milwaukee's population by 1860. They made Milwaukee the most German city in the U.S. and also the so-called German Athens, the center of culture, fine art, music, and theater, and painting as well. The main thing all those Germans had in common was that they had nothing in common. Other groups are relatively monolithic, one background, but the Germans, economically, they ranged from people who arrived with the clothes on their backs to Fred Miller, the brewer, who came here with $9,000 in gold on his person. This is before traveler's checks, so he used to carry this stuff with him. And you have, politically, they were ranked from revolutionaries to royalists. And religiously, some were Catholic, some were Lutheran, some were Reformed, and before the Civil War, there were 3 German Jewish synagogues in Milwaukee. So you had a rather remarkable diversity in one group, and the main thing that they tried to stress was the diversity of their own community. Some of them rose to facts or to positions of leadership, and among those were the Adler and Friend families, who were powers in the garment business. They each had hundreds of employees, and during the Civil War, David Adler's firm sewed hundreds, thousands of blue wool uniforms for the Union Army. So we were outfitting this boys in blue right here in Milwaukee. Adler and his fellow Jews maintained their own houses of worship. They observed the high holy days. They organized fraternals like B'nai B'rith, going back to 1861. But they were Germans and Jews, not one or the other, but both. And that hybrid identity was really exposed, or certainly surfaced back in 1874, when a group called the Sons of Hermann, they're not around anymore, don't Google Sons of Hermann, but they sponsored a parade and picnic that attracted nearly 800 members of Milwaukee's German fraternals, and that group included the Oddfellows, the Knights of Pythias, the Druids, and significantly B'nai B'rith. So these are all Germans who were, in some ways, early versions of Rotarians back in 1874. The orator of the day during that parade and picnic was Rabbi Elias Epstein of Temple B'nai Yeshurun. He was addressing a diverse throng, and he gave a robust declaration of German and German-American cultural identity. It's also a nice checklist of what people back in 1874 thought were the kind of the German attributes. So here's his words: "We are Germans by tongue, Germans by will of reasoning our way upwards, Germans by the avowed determination to develop our mental faculties, Germans by the desire to seek knowledge and wisdom and foster them, Germans by uniting in social life, and Germans by assisting each other in times of need. But we wish not to express the idea to our fellow citizens that we will remain Germans bound by the state. We are members of this great republic, and such we will remain. We are Americans, but German Americans who are willing to amalgamate the good we brought from Europe with the good which we found here." So kind of a hyphenate identity, and both were equally important to the Germans and German Jews as well. They were comfortable in Milwaukee. They had found a home here. The Reform temples were symbols of achievement and models of decorum, but they also had company back in the later 1800s, poverty and pogroms, and that was a toxic combination back in the late 1800s, unleashed a wave of immigrants who really swept from Europe across the United States, and they virtually overwhelmed some communities in Milwaukee and elsewhere. They were lumped together as Russian Jews because they came from the Russian Empire, but they had a multitude of backgrounds. They might have been Polish, Hungarian, Lithuanian, Ukrainian, or Romanian, but they were part of that great empire in Eastern Europe. They all spoke Yiddish, which is kind of a blend of Hebrew and medieval German, or as Billy Crystal said, Hebrew, German, and phlegm. You know, it's kind of three ingredients of Yiddish. But they could easily tell each other apart by nuances of dialect and diet and dress, other cultural giveaways. What they had in common was suffering, and they had suffered for generations in the old world. That first wave of refugees hit American shores back in 1881, and every Jewish community in America of any size was expected, not just asked, but expected, to take kind of a quota of refugees. In June of 1882, Milwaukee's first contingent of 218 men, women, and children stepped off the train. They were as sorry a lot of humanity as Milwaukee had ever seen. Some sick, all hungry, dirty, travel-weary, and still traumatized by the violence they'd experienced in their homeland. So the German Jewish charities, which had been around for years by that time, sprang into action. Volunteers whisked the refugees away to shelter in some old industrial buildings near downtown, the Third Ward especially. A guy named Bernhard Gross, who was a soap maker born in Hungary, led the effort, and he said many carts full of eatables and clothing were unloaded at temporary quarters and disappeared as if by magic. At the Blaskow Dye Works, idle vats were turned into bathtubs. Another shelter, one woman gave birth within 2 days of her arrival, and a second delivered soon after. They named their babies Washington and Garfield, making themselves at home here. But you had, even in those very, very first days, you had kind of a cultural conflict rose to the surface. The German Jews were assimilated. You could not tell on the street that they were different in any way. So you have the Russian Jews arrive with their old world dress, the long beards, the payas, the forelocks, sidelocks of tradition. A sense of shared people goes far, but only so far. Local volunteers were horrified by the appearance of their guests, and the Milwaukee Sentinel described what happened next. When their ablutions had been concluded, after being kind of bathed in these idol vats, the chief committee thought it well to call barbers into requisition to relieve the male refugees of their barbarous superfluity of hair. Who writes like that anymore? Most men yielded a very tardy assent to the application of the razor to their chins, and one was so demonstrative in opposition that it was necessary to invoke the presence of a policeman to reduce him to order. Imagine that. These hosts are bringing people in to help them and saying, we insisted on looking just like the people who were here already. So what you had going on was assimilation by coercion, and it took place in the very first hours they were here in Milwaukee. But the result that Bernard Gross was proud of, he said within 3 days, this trainload of dilapidated humanity had the appearance of a lot of American citizens in caucus assembled. Superficial, but they at least looked like other Americans. So there was obviously a yawning gulf between the German Jews and the Eastern European Jews, and that gulf found geographic expression. The German Jews were kind of all over town, but their main settlement was on Milwaukee's east side, and that became the heart of their community. While the Eastern Europeans, who very quickly outnumbered their hosts by a ratio of 2 or 3 to 1, were largely West Siders. Their main neighborhood was the Haymarket neighborhood. There was once a Haymarket on 5th and Valete. It's kind of, think of them as gas stations. It was fuel for hungry horses. And that was an area between roughly 3rd and 12th, Juneau and Walnut. So kind of industrial, if you can picture that today, kind of coming back. Hillside Terrace is up on the area of the hillside going up to 6th Street. And by 1900, there were nearly 5,000 people shoehorned into that single square mile, and there were a dozen synagogues. So this was really a very densely settled part of Milwaukee. All those shuls were Orthodox by definition, and it was not even capitalized back then. It was just Orthodox. That was a Judaism they had known for generations in the old country. And their rituals also varied by national origin, which is why you had so many synagogues in one very small area. So that gap between the natives and newcomers was certainly wide, but there was one woman who was determined to bridge it, and that was Elizabeth Black Kander, Lizzie Kander, one of my favorite figures in the book. She was a German Jew, born in Milwaukee, daughter of a South Side dry goods merchant, and president of something called the Ladies Relief Sewing Society. And they're fairly innocent. They sewed clothes for what Kander called at one time our unfortunate brethren, especially in the Haymarket area. But Lizzie had a great capacity for growth, and she kind of moved beyond that kind of condescending attitude and came to think that simply handing out clothes was not really helping the situation of the refugees. So back in 1895, she and some allies organized something called the Keep Clean Mission, organized toward kids, and it was in the vestry rooms of B'nai Yeshurun on 10th and Kilbourne. They had games, singing, crafts. For the boys, they had manual training. For the girls, they had cooking classes, and for both, they had lessons in hygiene. So they were trying to keep these kids clean. That program was so popular that they broadened their focus to include adults. And in 1900, her group bought an old house on 5th and Galena at the very heart of the Haymarket neighborhood. So these are kind of east side 53217 types, kind of moving right to the heart of the inner city. So this was really kind of a major jump into the heart of the ghetto. They called their home the Settlement, and this was in the tradition of Jane Addams' Hull House, which was organized not many years before. It was busy from 9 a.m. to 11 p.m. every day of the week. And what it became was the earliest ancestor of the JCC, Jewish Community Center. It did not have things for kids so much, but adults, manual training, sewing societies, an expanding cooking school, debating societies, literary clubs, a penny savings bank, a public library branch, a night school for more than 200 students, and a library stocked with Yiddish newspapers. So it was serving a large community and serving them well. Those programs did not run on air, and Lizzie was a superb fundraiser, and the idea she had was to publish a cookbook based on recipes that she had developed for the cooking classes and supplemented with people who were kind of working for the cause as well. So she had this cookbook, and she asked her board, all guys, to fund the printing. $18 is what they were asked to fund. They refused. They declined. They didn't think there was a market for the Settlement Cookbook. It turned out to be a runaway hit, sold out as first edition within months at 50 cents a copy, and made $500 in profits for the settlement house. And even though it no longer features ingredients like suet and clotted cream and goose fat, the Settlement Cookbook is still in print and still generates revenue for Jewish charities in Milwaukee. So Lizzie Kander is a compelling figure, but Milwaukee's Jewish community produced another heroine who was not from here, arrived back in 1906 from what is now Pinsk in Belarus with her mom and her older sister. They come to join their father, who had arrived a couple of years earlier and began to work for the Milwaukee Road. And her name was Golda Meir. You know where I'm going with this. We have a library and a school both named for her. She certainly took part in Lizzie Kander's settlement programs, but first she had to adjust to her new surroundings. She found life in Milwaukee spellbinding, and here's her account of a visit to Schuster's department store on 3rd and Garfield. I was delighted by my pretty new clothes, by the soda pop and ice cream, and by the excitement of being in a real skyscraper, the first 5-story building I had ever seen. It did not exist in Pinsk. So in general, I thought Milwaukee was wonderful. Everything looked so colorful and fresh as though it had just been created, and I stood for hours staring at the traffic and the people. It was all completely strange and unlike anything I'd ever seen or known before, and I spent the first days in Milwaukee in a kind of trance. So Golda is enchanted by what she finds in the new world. That trance was broken soon enough. Her family lived in a 2-room, not 2-bedroom, a 2-room apartment on 6th and Walnut, a place she'd eventually know as kind of a hovel. But she adjusted, graduated at the top of her class from 4th Street School, now named for her. She grew up to be a committed Zionist as well as a Milwaukee socialist, attended what's now UWM, worked at the library for a time, and left for Israel finally in 1921 at the age of 23. As Golda Meir, she would become probably the most famous ex-Milwaukeean in history, as she became Prime Minister of Israel back in 1969. So Lizzie and Golda were 2 women any city would be proud to call its own, but they also kind of marked that contrast between the Germans and Eastern Europeans, between wealth and poverty. Those divisions did narrow over time. The Haymarket families moved north and west to neighborhoods like Sherman Park, especially. And they reached that by the 1920s and swelled the enrollment at Washington High School, became among the best schools in the Milwaukee area. They also turned Center and Burleigh streets into the new version of Synagogue Row. Had been Cherry Street, now it became Center and Burleigh. And there were conservative congregations by then as well as Orthodox. So the East Side-West Side distinction retained its power for generations, but eventually, especially after World War II, those West Siders began to move across the river to the East Side and join that movement of their Germanic neighbors or cousins up to the North Shore, Shorewood, Whitefish Bay, Glendale, Fox Point, Bayside, eventually Mequon. By the early 2000s, Synagogue Row was Mequon Road. So you have kind of this migration from Hillside to Sherman Park all the way up into Ozaukee County. What's amazing is the impact this relatively small community has had on the larger area of Milwaukee over the years. There have never been more than 25 or 30,000 Jews in Milwaukee in total, but think of what they've founded. Not just landmarks like Mount Sinai Hospital or the JCC, but all those businesses. Our retail giants, including Boston Store, Gimbel's, Schuster's, were all run by Jewish merchants. Milwaukee was a giant in the garment trade, thanks to Jewish-owned firms like Junior House, Florence Eiseman, Reliable Knitting, Jack Winter, Eagle Knitting, and the Phoenix and Holeproof hosiery firms. The Cole family parlayed a single corner store in Bayview into Wisconsin's largest grocery store chain. Cole's suppliers included Peck Meatpacking, a family-run company that was a national player. And in the field of entertainment, Ben Marcus back in 1935 opens a single 500-seat theater in Ripon, Wisconsin, and grows that to become the largest chain in Wisconsin and now among the largest in the entire U.S. Real estate moguls Joe Zilber and George Bockel cut their teeth on Milwaukee projects and expanded to a national, certainly, platform. Real estate attorney Max Carl thought he could do a better job of insuring mortgages than the government. So back in 1957, he founds his Mortgage Guarantee Insurance Corporation and makes Magic the biggest insurer of mortgages in the entire country. Harry Soref turned his idea for a laminated padlock into the Masterlock company and in time mastered the entire padlock market. Nate Zalazzo founded Astronautics back in 1959 and rocketed to a position of leadership in aerospace engineering systems. Law partners Aaron Scheinfeld and Elmer Winter they benefited from temporary help in their own firm and said, we can do this on a broader scale. So they began to offer that service to others, and in 1948 that became Manpower, and in time the largest employer in the entire world. If you broaden your view beyond the business world, you'll find Washington High School alums like Jerome Silverman, better known as Gene Wilder, and baseball commissioner Bud Selig, and U.S. Senator and former Bucks owner Herb Kohl. So from Shel Lubar and Marty Stein to Ben Barkin, the Zucker brothers, I doubt that there is one ethnic or religious group in Milwaukee of comparable size who's ever had that large an impact on the entire Milwaukee area. That impact has taken place despite some major internal differences that have only deepened with time, and the familiar lines between conservative, reformed, orthodox, those are ones we're all somewhat aware of. On a larger scale, how do you find common ground between a Lubavitcher, a Reconstructionist, and a friend of mine who describes himself as a third-generation atheist? Where do you put someone who loves klezmer music and kreplach, but wouldn't be caught dead inside a synagogue? How do you reconcile hawks and doves, the observant and the assimilated, the intermarried and the insular? The answer is you can't, but you don't have to. In Milwaukee and elsewhere, the Jewish community exists as a fractious and somewhat fragmented conglomeration of very different viewpoints, but all those internal contradictions are held up in permanent suspension, subsumed and in some sense overruled by an underlying sense of community. Milwaukee's Jews have followed many paths indeed, but they are still one people, as old as Abraham, as fresh as tomorrow. Thank you. Thanks very much. Are there any questions, corrections, additions, amendments? Do you have any questions? Yeah. Maureen. Alfred Bader. Yes. The question was, Aldrich Chemical, was that owned by a Jewish merchant? And that's, Alfred Bader was the founder. And he's written, I think, a 2-volume autobiography that tells the story of being a refugee in World War II and how he came to find his way to applied chemistry. And obviously a major art collector as well. Yeah, George?
Why did the community move from Sherman Park to the east side as opposed to normally where people were further out?
The question was, why did the Jewish community move across to the east side instead of north and west? And you're right, that would have been the pattern. You know, so the Gentile Germans would have kept on moving out, you know, Watertown Plank or Appleton or Green Bay out to the north and west sides. I think what was going on, by the years after World War II, you have, for one thing, a greater sense of Jewish peoplehood around the birth of Israel back in 1947. So a greater sense after the Holocaust of sort of a shared fate. I think that was one thing that was operating. You also had West Siders who had, after generations of kind of rising and certainly beginning in the most dire poverty, you know, that Milwaukee had known up to that time, they are rising economically, and kind of the North Shore became the place to go. The institutions kind of moved there as well. So, for instance, you know, Bethel begins in Washington Heights, moved up to Sherman Park, and eventually up to Mequon. So in some sense, they were following their members, but I think it was sort of this larger migration of community that was feeling more unity, than it had. By that time, if you talk to any Jew in Milwaukee who was raised here since the 1930s, the east side, west side distinction is really strong. Where did you grow up? I was an east sider or a west sider. That began to narrow, that began to meld. And now today, Beth Yehuda is the only synagogue left in Sherman Park. The Twersky family, kind of this rabbinic dynasty. And they have something like maybe 300 households, and it's just fascinating to go up there. I have friends in the community. And been up there for dinner and just walking around on a Friday evening wishing each other good Shabbos. It's a real powerful sense of community. So they are, in some ways, kind of either recreating or restoring kind of what had been present back in the hillside neighborhood back in the turn of the 20th century. Any other questions? Yeah. Mr. Gimbel.
How did the German Jews and the Eastern European Jews collaborate, if at all, during World War II when we had the Bund in Milwaukee and this environment?
The question was, how, if at all, did German and Eastern European Jews cooperate during World War II? And I was just studying this. The Bund met at the Forstkeller, which was now the home of the brand new Pabst Brewery. And at the risk of losing their license, they revoked that invitation. So it was something that was short-lived. But I think the answer, the real answer, Frank, is that during World War II, you were so bent on the war effort that by the time Pearl Harbor happens, there really was no longer an issue of disloyalty. And one of the best stories is that the Bund had bought a camp up in Grafton, and along the Milwaukee River. And they used that, they called themselves the Silver Shirts. They would march the kids, with the Heil Hitler. And the established Germans in Milwaukee, and that would have included German Jews as well, were so incensed and to some degree sensitive about besmirching the good name of Germans in Milwaukee that they bought that camp out from under the Bund and made it their own and called it Camp Schurz. After Carl Schurz, the 48er who was a member of Lincoln's cabinet. So there was cooperation, but by that time, again, those differences are beginning to somewhat be absorbed, and it became a non-issue after the shooting started. There was the Bund. It was largely a group of people who had come here since World War I. The Treaty of Versailles certainly had a devastating impact on the German people, a very punitive treaty, not like the ones after World War II. So people who came here disaffected and to some degree emasculated. So the Third Reich, kind of spoke to their need for recovering power. And the earlier Germans said, not us, not us, not in our watch. So they pretty much really put their heel down on that movement. Yeah, Andrea. What kind of? Oh, sure. Was there anti-Semitism in Milwaukee? This is America. There was anti-Semitism here as well. And there are families who talk about moving into the old German Gentile neighborhood in the northwest side and being refused homes to rent because we didn't want these Jews in the old neighborhood. And perhaps the most overt discrimination was the resorts up in Washington County. Cedar Lake was one place. You had a lot of Jews would go up there for summer vacations. But there were resorts who would put in their advertisement saying Gentiles only. So it was open and shut. On the professional level, Mount Sinai Hospital was organized back in 1903 and projected as a gift of Milwaukee's Jews to the rest of us. It was also a place for Jewish doctors to practice who had not been welcome to join the staffs of the Christian hospitals. So it gave them an occupational outlet. So there was always a subtext, certainly. Yes?
I'm Catholic, and my grandfather was Catholic, and we lived with him until I was 10 years old, way out on 140th and North Avenue, where he was caretaker for Mount Zion Cemetery.
Yeah.
And by the time I was 10, I probably attended more Jewish funerals. What prompted him to go way out into the farm country of Brookfield? We were surrounded by
The question is, why are there Jewish cemeteries in what is now Exurbia? And the reason goes back to biblical times when you had to bury your dead outside the city walls. So you would not have had a metropolitan cemetery, an urban cemetery. And the pattern is general. You go down to Cudahy, go out to Greenfield, go out to, I think, out in Wauwatosa. So there are Jewish cemeteries that were established when that was not just the outer ring of suburbs, that was out in the country. The oldest cemetery in Milwaukee, oldest Jewish cemetery, is right around Union Cemetery, up between Atkinson and Titonia at around Locust Street. If you can place that, Calvary Baptist is right there. So it's called a Union Cemetery because it was a union of different Lutheran congregations. So it was not one big happy family. But even before that, right across the street, you have, going back to the 1840s, you have a Jewish cemetery there, the Hopkins Street Burial Ground, which is the first communal act of Jews in Milwaukee. And now those bodies have been sort of exhumed and moved elsewhere, and there's just one marker there that kind of identifies all the families who were buried there. There must still be bodies there. When I was working on the book, I wanted to get a picture of it, and it is forbidding. It's kind of overgrown, surrounded by a cyclone fence, so I actually had to shinny under a cyclone fence to get in there and take a photograph. But that is the first communal act of the community, and one that when they put it out there back in the 1840s, that was gone. That was way out in the edge of town. But that's where it comes from. Yeah, Kate? Kate said, what'll I talk about next time I come? By spring of next year, the Wisconsin Historical Society should have published a book called Milwaukee, a City Built on Water. As you know, water is hot these days on a wide variety of levels. And the book does talk about, turned the manuscript last Monday, industry, recreation, transportation, pollution. There's some of the descriptions of the river and the waterfront back around the turn of the 20th century are just horrifying. You know, you would not think about it. I promise not to read some of those at lunch, but that'll be out, and it's a fascinating story. Yes? Yes, sir. The JCC, the Jewish Community Center, goes back to it's a long genealogy. It goes back to the settlement there on 5th and Galena. It moves to the area the east side of downtown, kind of moves up to Prospect Avenue, and then moves out to the Old Country Day School campus out in Whitefish Bay. So it's kind of a chain going way out there. They moved there back in the 1980s. But they have one unbroken lineage all the way back to the heart of the Hillside Haymarket neighborhood back in the turn of the 20th century. President Nancy is coming up. So we have time for one more or not? One more? Yes, sir.
I've heard that the altar at Old St. Mary's Church,
Mm-hmm.
at least I don't know if it's a rumor or it's a story, was donated to the German Bavarians by Ludwig, the man king of Bavaria.
The question or observation was the altar at Old St. Mary's there on Broadway and Wells given by King Ludwig of Bavaria? The answer is yes. You know, this is back in the pioneer days. You understand, this is missionary country. You know, back in the 1830s, 40s, 50s. Whatever your faith was, this was kind of the frontier. So whatever you could do to promulgate the faith, they would go back, and some of the Catholic priests developed this into an art. They'd go back to Europe on begging trips and come back with resources to kind of plant the faith on the frontier. So yes, that was a pattern. Yep. Okay, thank you all for your attention. See you next time.
An MCM production.